Hey, what's up, listeners? I'm excited to introduce you, Juan the Angulo. I got it right.
That's right. Yeah.
We actually met through Ivy, which is this social networking. They call it the social university, and Juan is just like a really interesting dude. Like, just loves like really connected guy, and I feel like he's really good at like building deep, like authentic connection. And I'm just fascinated by him, like just someone who just like a world explorer. Like I feel like you're a very complex individual. You have like a lot of interesting like thoughts and just philosophies, and just the way you think about life is to me just fascinating. So I'm just curious to just like kind of like dig deeper into um, the things that make you unique. And yeah, I just wanted to I just thought this would be a very interesting conversation to have.
Thank you. Thank you, Davidson. I think it's awesome to be here. Definitely the first time I've ever been on a podcast, and definitely humbled by your accolades of thinking myself as an interesting subject to have. But yeah, I think everyone's got some interesting idiosyncrasies to talk about. So happy to share any of mine.
Yeah. So I feel like what like I'm really curious about is like what drove you to just want to like explore the world. Like I know we all want to do it, and I know a lot of us think about doing it, but many of us don't do it, right? But you actually like went out and did it. So
Yeah, I can share a little bit of that. So without taking too much of the time that we have, I guess I'll preface it like this. I graduated from university back in 2016, and then I had a job lined up in New York City with an investment bank, and then decided that's not exactly what I want to do with my life. So I looked for an interesting opportunity within the space of New York, startup space, I mean, and that's how I got connected with Ivy and met you. And eventually, I thought, it's just not um, how I see myself doing things at this age. So I moved out of New York and had some money saved up, and eventually bought a one-way ticket with a couple of friends to Tokyo, to Japan. And to be honest, I didn't have this whole traveling the world itinerary set in mind. It was more of like, right now I'm looking for a new job, and a lot of the interviews are virtual. So I'll buy a one-way ticket, continue preparing for my interviews as I get to, travel a little bit of Tokyo for now, and then see where things go. So if at any point I need to go back to the States to take an in-person interview, like for example, I think I had at the time some interviews set up with like the Fed or the IMF. And so I was thinking, if they ever need me to be in person, I'll do it in a second. But for now, it makes sense to just keep going. And so I started in Tokyo, spent a couple, almost a month in Tokyo and the surrounding area. Um, an amazing city. Now, obviously, like I had just lived in New York City, huge, both huge cities of, population density wise, and with so many interesting personalities and subcultures and groups and things you can get into. And I loved it. I really love New York for what it is, but Tokyo for me may take the cake as far as like a big city to live in, only because I feel like it has the same energies that New York caters to people. Like you can do anything at any time of the day, any day of the week, but and you can find a group of people who are interested in whatever you're interested in, as arcane as it may or may not be. But at the same time, it's very clean and organized in a way, and I think that's a product of the Japanese culture and taking pride in their work. And Subway, for example, Subway workers wearing like white gloves and very like proper uniforms, and that's something I really enjoyed about Tokyo. And then eventually, going back to the traveling thing, I wasn't getting any requests to interview in person, so I started traveling down to Hakone, which is a small village outside of Mount Fuji, climbed up to station 4 wanting to reach the peak, but it was winter time, so this is right after New Year's, and so they don't actually allow tourists to climb up past, I think, station 4 or 5 at this time of the year because of the icy conditions, and it leads to a lot of fatalities, unfortunately. So I didn't get to summit it, but maybe one day in the summertime I'll visit back. And then eventually went down to Kyoto, which is an amazing city, only because, or not only, but one of the reasons is why, because a lot of the temples, original temples in Tokyo and other cities in Japan were bombed during World War II, but Kyoto was not bombed during World War II. So it has a lot of the temples there. And then eventually Osaka, and then flew out to Singapore to meet with a high school friend who's living out there, had a spare bedroom. And then, to cut things a little shorter, I went over to Australia, to Sydney, Newcastle, Queensland, went camping out there. Eventually landed in the North Island, in Auckland in New Zealand, the North Island in New Zealand. And then rented a car and had my camping gear there the whole time, and just camped out from the very northern tip of the North Island all the way to the southern tip. So it was incredible. I think one of the reasons why I did it was, one, I wasn't planning on doing it, so I kind of just was going along with whatever cards were dealt through my job hunting process. And then also, I think I'm also pretty bare and bone. Like I'm not like when I travel, I'm not so much looking to stay at like very nice hotels, because I didn't plan on doing so. I didn't really have the means to do so. I wanted to stretch my small savings as long as I could, and I had my camping gear. So I stayed, for example, in Tokyo, I was staying at a hostel, maybe $30-$40 a night. That was actually like a clinic or some sort of like mental hospital way back in the day that had been transformed into a hostel. So it was kind of like a creepy, but it was actually a really nice hostel, like in the end of the day. And then I also was camping out, so like camping fees are what, $10 max, like a night. So, that's one reason I think that I was able to travel for so many months with, not like a huge amount of sums of money. Eventually I would go back to Colombia, where I was born, and then did finish my travels there. And before I went back to the States to finish my job hunting process. But I guess in a long answer as it was, that's some of the reasons why I kind of just fell onto my lap and went as I went. I just kind of took it day by day.
That's awesome. And so what was the total? How many months was that all in total from Japan and then back to Colombia?
So if you count Colombia as part of the traveling process, because at the end of the day, my parents do have a house in the mountainside there, but I moved out of Colombia when I was 8, back in 2001, right before 9/11, in the summer of 2001. And so I haven't seen a lot of Colombia as a young adult. So I was actually traveling within Colombia, my country of birth, for the first time freely in my life. So had my parents, they have a second home in the mountainside there as well. They're based out of Houston, Texas, so they weren't there. And I had the family truck to kind of just be able to get around from city to city. And so if you count that part of the trip, technically it was from before New Year's and up to June. So I went back to the States to celebrate my dad's 60th birthday in August. So it was roughly 6 months, give or take. So, and that's not by any means the longest of all, world traveling seafaring trips, but it was nice for me, given the circumstances.
Well, what was your favorite town in Colombia? I know that I'm sure there's a big, every town is different. But like, what was your favorite part about just like, what was different now that you're an adult versus when you were much younger.
Yeah. So one of my favorite towns is actually where my parents have a house at. It's a small colonial town, um, 2 hours northeast of Bogota, the capital. So that's where we were born, Bogota. But their house is in a little colonial town that's based in a really interesting geographical area that is a prehistoric sea. So there's fossils. Every hike, you can take lots of hikes because obviously there's the Andes Mountains, and there's fossils to be found everywhere. Like you find them as if, I don't know, as if you find like any common sort of lizard or animal here in Houston. But like it's a really interesting town with a lot of history, Spanish colonial architecture, cobbled streets, really, really picturesque, like pockets of the village, and it's relatively very safe. I know obviously Colombia's got a dark 90s and 80s history to deal with, and so luckily that's kind of behind us, the worst. And so it's a very historically safe town because there's a military base, very, very close. And so it's a safe town. It's very like everybody knows everybody in this town. Like, who people who live there know who everyone is. And yeah, it has a high tourist population as well all year round. So there's a lot of Europeans, especially, who visit this town. In fact, there's a Frenchman who visited it and fell in love with it and opened up his own French restaurant in the town. So that's just one of the people who have fallen in love with it and just decided to live there. So I think that would take the cake.
That's awesome. And I feel like you're also I feel like you have a pretty high standard of excellence, right? Is that one reason why you enjoyed Japan so much? Because you felt like people really put their heart and soul into the creations, into their creative endeavors there?
Yeah, so thank you. I like to think so. I guess I grew up. My first big dream in life was to become a professional tennis player, and so I went when I was 10 years old. I went to professional tennis tournament with my parents and an uncle, and I just saw them in person. I was like, wow, they reached perfection. I was lucky enough to see Roger Federer like back in 2003 and 2004, like one of his best career years ever. And so it's kind of like I saw athletic perfection at a very young age, and I wanted to pursue that. And I think that's instilled in me a very like, as you put it, maybe like excellent driven individual. And so what I appreciate about Japanese culture is that it doesn't matter what you do in the end of the day, whether it's you're an investment banker or you are someone who works on the ground, either a gardener or someone who works in the public transportation system, bus driver, subway individual. Like, as long as you take pride in your work, I think it'll give you a sense of fulfillment. Obviously, there's some jobs that fit better to individuals' personalities, but if you put your heart into what you do, whether it's a simple task or a very complicated task, I think it becomes more rewarding and you do it better. And so I do appreciate not only how creative Japanese culture is, but I guess you touch on an interesting point, is that Japan is an island at the end of the day with a huge population, right? And so it's been a culture, a population that's had to make their means or their resources last. So I think they're really known for recycling things because they know that they don't have these huge, vast spaces to create landfills, for example. And so I think they really know how to make spaces, small spaces, whether it's in Tokyo or another city, really cater to functional requirements, and then also become very innovative along the way. And so I think you're right. I think that's something I do admire about Japanese culture, and as well as other cultures. Singapore, I think, also is a city state, so it's something that becomes I guess, delved into the fabric of their culture and their and the limited resources that they have to make them last. And I think that's when human ingenuity really is comes into play. I think I do admire it. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and walk me through a little bit more about like your like photography and your video. Like I feel like you're like a very like you like it seems like you like adventure, right? You like the depth of like I feel like a duality. You have like a duality where you appreciate like people's like suffering and like how that sometimes creates like the most human connection in a way because we all in a way like experience some sort of hardships like in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess I'm curious as to why you're compelled to, like these things. I don't know. Yeah, I know that's like a pretty loaded question.
That's a good question. Maybe the best questions are all pretty loaded, but I think you're right. I mean, so I guess I'll break it up into parts. I think one, I do admire people's experiences, and when it comes to growth, I think there's no better teacher than suffering a lot of times. And I know that's hard to hear, but I think that's also woven into, I guess, Stoicism and their philosophy. For those listeners who may not be familiar with Stoicism, it was actually a school of thought practiced by a few very prominent and well-known philosophers. Among them was Marcus Aurelius, who obviously a Roman emperor, right? So, I first I was introduced to Stoicism along my travels in Australia. I was with a family friends who hosted me, and in their guest room, it was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and I was like, I just picked up the book one night, and I just fell in love with the ideas that essentially suffering, if you welcome it and you accept it, and you see potential and opportunity for growth, you won't regret. You will actually start appreciating those moments in your life where you struggled, where there's, you don't know if you can, or you don't know how far you can, or how hard you can dig until you have to, basically. And so I think that's something I appreciated. Obviously, I'm by no means someone who's suffered a lot relative to other people, but you're right that everyone does suffer, no matter what your upbringing, whether it's super wealthy or whether you come from the Indian slums. I think some of my favorite books are those that kind of touch on the idea that we're all connected by this human condition of highs and lows, and the lows just tend to be the ones where we grow the most. And so, yeah, so when it comes to photography, my subjects a lot of times are individuals who I feel like tell a story only by just the grit in their nails, or how much dirt is under their nails. I like, a lot of my photos are people, for example, in farmers market in Colombia. I love taking photos of different farmers who come in and sell their products, and you can just tell like they've done their years with hard work, literally back-breaking work. And so, but photography is also a way in which I think my travels not only were able to capture a lot of interesting individuals who I feel like did have suffered, but also have pretty probably wise ways of thought because of it. But I think photography is also a way for me to share some of these fantastic, incredible places that the earth has to offer, and that hopefully we, within my very small social circle, can appreciate and try and conserve. Because I think, our generation and the generations that are coming, just after us, have to really dig deep and be very innovative of ways of how we can conserve our planet Earth and be able to pass it on to others. And so whether my photography is one way of documenting this or inspiring others to see it and conserve it, that would be really what I'm looking to do. So for example, I'll give you I guess one example would be I was camping out in Queensland. Sorry, not Queensland. It's I missing the name here. But anyways, it's in the South Great Barrier Reef, part of Australia, and it's there's something called the Bartle Scale, and that measures light pollution. And in the continental U.S., there's now very few places that have a low score, and low by meaning low light pollution score. But Australia, on the other hand, has a lot of places like this. And so you could see, and I was lucky because I was traveling there when there was, not a big moon. So the light pollution from the moon is also quite low.
Oh.
And I was able to capture the Milky Way arm. And so I think, when people ask me about how you get this photo, I was like, well, listen, it's not just me, it's not just the camera. Obviously, it's a long light exposure. So, you keep the camera eye open for several seconds instead of like a 1/200th of a second, which is kind of like the regular photograph that you see. But also the conditions were correct. Like one, I was in a place where it has very low light pollution, and two, it was the right time of the year, right time of the month, with regards to like the moon phases. And so it's a really incredible place. You should totally visit, but also like keep in mind that light pollution has got its, pretty detrimental effects. Like, for example, I've read that like insects now, because of the high light pollution, think that it's daylight when it's nighttime. And so it's having some, pervasive effects and detrimental effects on insect population. And that just goes down to the food chain, right? Like, I know that we don't eat as many insects as probably we should, but other animals do. And so we'll feel the effects eventually of light pollution and of its own. Forget about CO2 emissions. Obviously, that's a huge problem. But you can take things like this and educate yourself and educate others to just one photograph. So I think that makes it interesting, keeping things in perspective and also learning from those experiences.
Wow, that's fascinating. I feel like you have like a really good sense of like the dualities of life. Like I feel like it's like you understand like the yin and yang of like a lot of things. Is that why you're into like macroeconomics, but then you're also like really like, I don't know, man. I feel like
You touched on so many subjects with like one question.
yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess I do like dualities or dichotomies of things. Probably some of my favorite artwork is a lot of black and white, yin yang sort of motifs. I never thought about how I like economics, but perhaps you're right. There's obviously a bit of a dance between the micro and the macro, like what affects one small company will have ripple effects in the macro sense of things. And there's also, there's just a bit of an effect, a chain effect, right? Something, starts with one person or one company can have mass effects on an entire sector. For example, I was just watching an interesting documentary on Netflix. I think it's called History 101. But what it's essentially saying is that consumers have a lot more power than you think. So I know that individuals think, oh, it's just one person, like whatever I buy, it's not going to make a big effect. But if you look at it, we're going through a huge transformation. Like people are there's a lot more veganism being practiced. There's also a lot more people looking for environmentally conscious supply chains and foods. For example, just the fast food industry. We have, I think, multiple chains. I think maybe Burger King is now including the Impossible Burger, because consumers are now being more not only cognizant of like how many calories, but also how much CO2 and methane is produced by cows, and cows are where we get our meat from. And so that's having big effects. Like, at the end of the day, like consumers, although one person might start this conversation, it might have ripple effects to anybody who listens to this podcast, for example, might start buying the Impossible Burger. That's going to increase the demand for environmentally friendly food options, and the suppliers, the fast food chains, they're hypersensitive to these sort of social demands. And so I think that's an interesting topic, probably an entire podcast on its own. But I think that yeah, I guess you're right. I do appreciate that about economics or anything really. We're social creatures, and so I think an idea from just one person can change a lot, the macro sense of things. So it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, and then I feel like we're ping-ponging back and forth, but I do agree with you that the suffering has, I guess for me, has actually led to the greatest change, right? But it's like I don't see it until much, much later. For instance, like if I didn't have all this trauma growing up of like not having a father, or feeling like I didn't have family, or that I feel like I didn't belong in any social group or belong anywhere,
Yeah.
I don't think I would be so interested into like doing things like even like this podcast or writing my book or my, like hosting a lot of events and the stuff I do for social impact and social justice and stuff like that. Like, I feel like if I lived like a relatively, I guess, less,
Cushion and very.
I would have just been okay with like the status quo,
Sure.
So it's interesting that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right. And I think some people endure hardships at different times in their lives. Like some people, like I had a pretty easy upbringing, to be honest. Like I'm very privileged. Even in the States, like I don't have a lot of the stigmas around maybe probably Hispanic people or people of color. I have, like I said in we're prepping for this podcast, like I have a pretty strong European heritage as well as Colombian native heritage, and so I grew up like people thinking I was white,
Yeah.
and not having a lot of the negative social impacts of being a Hispanic, being a Latino in the United States at the current time period. And so, like I said, like I had a pretty easy upbringing. I think it was until college, had a couple setbacks, and maybe even when I first started my career in New York, working at Goldman Sachs, like it wasn't easy. I would just go home every night and think like, who almost like, who am I? Like, who do I want to be? Like, is this where I see myself? And there was a lot of lonely times, but also, like you say, like I think in the long term, you look back and appreciate those hard times, because some of the most integral parts of your identity are an outcome of those hard times. Like you said, like you had a hard time growing up without a father, and maybe a reason why you want to connect with so many individuals on a very personal like level through your podcast and as well as your blogs and so on and so forth. And I've met you obviously several times in person, and it's a treat always just getting to talk to you, because I feel like, yeah, the undivided attention is there, and you don't want just like a very surface level conversation or topic. You enjoy having just deep conversations. And so like it's great meeting individuals who also are aware that, I think, again, the growth, the greatest growth comes out of these hard times. And so a diamond is made in through a lot of pressure and rough. It's like and I think everyone has it. Like there's no one who is immune to this growth. You might come from super well off family and have be like a hedge fund baby or whatever they're called, but like you might still have very difficult, you might have trouble in the household, parents who weren't maybe all there, or like
Right.
And so no one's immune to hardship. And I think that's something that connects us all, despite our backgrounds. And so as long as you look for opportunities or even careers that will eventually lead you to, be in peace with yourself, and then start teaching others or helping others, that's when you kind of reach sort of like this closer echelon of human purpose. I think that's that can come from anywhere. You don't have to have had the super rough, have been from a very poor country or a community or unprivileged life to be able to reach that. So I think that's something we both appreciate.
Yeah, that's actually one of the biggest realizations that I've had over the last couple of years, like just doing a lot of these self-development programs. But then the more empathetic and more compassionate I got, I realized like actually like I'm blessed in a lot of ways because like you said, like let's say, you were a quote unquote like hedge fund baby. There's a lot of pressure for you to be successful, to create something, to, whether it's to attend charity benefit dinners, right? So there's just a lot of pressure to be a certain way and to achieve a certain level of success that I'm grateful I didn't have any of that pressure, right? I'm lucky I even graduated from high school,
Right.
So,
Right.
it's a different struggle, but to your point, like it's like a human experience. Like we all go through it, and that's what makes us so the same at the same time. Even though, like so you might think you're different than everyone, like at the end of the day, we all go through the same exact emotions, right? But
Yeah.
people might not think of it that way just because like their skin color might be different or their accent is different or whatever it is, right? Maybe they grew up in a different part of the country or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. No one's immune to no amount of money or privilege it will make you immune to not going through hardships. And I think that's a blessing. That's what makes us all, I guess, go through this human drama together but apart, which is such an appropriate comment given that we're kind of going through social distancing. But
Yeah, yeah, it's in a way like this almost like levels like humanizes that even more, right? Because you could be like the wealthiest person and still get COVID and like, I mean, your mortality is still the same, but I don't want to be ignorant of the fact that like, hey, like if you're wealthy, you're more likely to like be able to like live without an income for, or lower income for a certain amount of, so, it's still, there's still a little bit of injustice obviously, but if you do catch it, like obviously like your chances of survival are still, you still have a, the ability to
yeah,
from it. So
right. Viruses don't discriminate between, tax brackets or country borders, really. So
yeah.
yeah, it's true. However, disclaimer, obviously, like a lot of the African American community has been dealt with probably the higher fatalities in the U.S. at least. So
Yeah.
something to be aware of. What does that say about our society and the kind of benefits or perhaps medical services, public health issues that kind of shows and reveals. So a lot to take in and consider. I think if we want to create a more equitable future, that's something we should definitely continue and work from. So
yeah, I feel like there's so many topics that we can discuss, and you're right, maybe could have another conversation, because there's so many ways we can go. But I guess like why I'm curious about like so and you know what I just noticed as well. Maybe you chose tennis because in a way tennis is like a very gritty sport where you're like almost like suffering, right? For lack of a better word. Because like in order to be like great in suffering, you basically have to endure the most pain, right? Just because it can be very long and enduring, but you're also sprinting. So, it's like, it really tests like, because it's like, it's not a team sport, but it kind of is. And like, I don't know, I guess I'm curious as to
yeah,
like tennis so much.
tennis is an interesting sport. I think it kind of gets not as much interest here in the States, especially among younger individuals. A lot of my friends who are athletes, it was all about baseball and basketball and football, American football, and with rightly so. I mean, that's like what you see on TV here in the States. But I think in a lot of European countries and a lot of just maybe the rest of the world, it's obviously soccer who takes the cake as being the most popular, but also tennis is up there. And I think I was introduced to it obviously through my father. Early on, even in Colombia, I remember being 6 years old, 7 years old, taking my first few lessons, and
Wow.
I didn't realize the magnitude. I guess like the life lessons you learn. And yes, you're right. So when you play doubles, it can be a team sport. Also, even playing singles, you could be playing a different team, and you kind of accumulate aggregate points for each match. So there could be I guess a team facet even when you're playing singles. But and then you look at the pros, and they have a huge team around them, whether it's their trainers, their coaches, the people who travel around them, physical therapists, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a team component, even though sometimes you see, especially the most coveted tennis champions out there are just singles players: Novak Djokovic, Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Andy Murray, Dan Wawrinka. All these guys, obviously, it's just singles, one against one. And there's great literature out there. Actually, I'm forgetting his name. The author who wrote Infinite Jest. What's his name again? Anyways, he wrote a fantastic article on the New York Times way back in the day, and about Roger Federer and what it's like to watch him. And he described it as a religious experience, because he almost reached like sort of this athletic nirvana. What's interesting about tennis is, and how he describes it as well in this article, is that it's a very, very mental sport. People who don't play it may not realize this, but it's much more mental than it is physical. And it becomes just very grinding mentally, as physical. Yes, definitely. Like, it's not a contact sport, but you are sprinting from left to right to diagonal in all directions, and our matches can last hours, right? So I think the longest match in Wimbledon of all time was, across 2 different days, and it was like over 10 hours or something like that. So it's grueling physically, yes, but it's also, in a way, I don't want to compare it to boxing, because again, it's not a contact sport. You're not throwing punches at each other's faces, but in a way, it is kind of like boxing, in that when you're out there on the court, it's just you out there who has to make all the decisions, and you have to find obviously be aware of your strengths, but you have to identify your opponent's weaknesses and go at them, literally point by point. And there's a lot of moments in matches where momentum shifts, I think, just like in boxing. And so you have to be self-aware of your strengths, but also you have to just gruel at someone's weaknesses. And so I think that's it makes you very mentally, it shapes you from a mental aspect. And so I think it took me a long time to kind of, I don't know, I guess, grow into it. It's something that you struggle with, especially I struggled with early on in, I guess, my tennis days. And I would be up in a match, have an opponent basically there at match point, and then start choking. And I think, Rafael Nadal, who is arguably my favorite player, he says it the best, like, you can't win, you can't achieve these trophies without a ton of losses throughout your life. And that losses could be metaphorical, or it could be like out on the court. And so it takes time, and just takes practice. There's no substitute for practice. No matter how talented you are at anything, like just hitting out, against the wall, against the machine, against the practice partner, like you have to put in the hours. And so I think that's something I've learned from tennis, and I'm hoping to put into whatever it is that I do with my career long-term wise, and being able to apply. So that's, I think that is something very applicable that you can take away from tennis, but a lot of sports. Rugby, I've heard, is incredible for team bonding, and also just pursuing, not like that kind of never give up situation. In tennis, not like in NBA, like there's no set time. There's no 90 minutes like in soccer. Like you can be down, have lost every point for 2 sets, or if it's 3 out of 5 match, but for one set and be down 5-0, love 40, and still come back. Like there's nothing holding you back except, your mentality, and then also obviously like the results. But like there's no time factor that will stop you from doing so. So in a way, it's almost like you have the power within you as long as you believe. And so I think that's what Nadal is so famous for, is like coming back from like the brink of loss, and then finding a way, just because he fights every single point as if it was his last. And I think that's what I admire most about him. And I think that's also something we can apply to anything in life. So I hope that answers kind of your question, but yeah, that's what I admire about tennis. And I think that's something very applicable.
Yeah, his biography was actually one of my favorite biographies, and I really like Sharapova's and Agassi's as well. They all share a common theme of like just grind, like really just grinding it out, right? When you're like super sore, you have injuries, and you're like, you're like down to your last like depleted, right? But all three of them, from reading the biographies, like they were just able to just really grind it out, and just the discipline and the amount of practice and like the sheer grit that you have to make it at that level, right? To
Yeah,
It's just inspiring, right? It's
it
like
is. Yeah.
sacrifice that you make, or like just toll you put on your body, and the amount of just like practice. Like I don't think there's any other sport where you practice as much, or at least it doesn't seem like it, right? From the amount of hours they wake up, and yeah, so it's I feel like it's so valuable. I'm sure it's helped you a lot in just like your career as well, right? Just like
Yeah, I think yeah, a lot of sports can be cutthroat, and tennis is no exception. And I think it teaches you, yeah, just don't try not to give up. Like just push a little hard, even when you think you can't go any further. Just push a little harder. Whether it's studying for that exam where you just feel like your head is about to explode, or for when you have to meet a deadline at work or whatever it is, like you can apply that mentality. And I think Nadal said it the best, very stoic, I guess, accidental or purposeful saying is like, enjoy the suffering. That's what he tells his kids in the Rafael Nadal Academy. It's like, and start to enjoy the suffering, because that's what's going to shape you. That's what's going to allow you to be mentally fit for when the actual real life circumstances demand it. And so I think that's really important.
yeah. So what's a more recent suffering that you've had that maybe something that like keeps coming up for you? Because I know for me, like being alone, I guess in my opinion, is like suffering, right? Because like how social I am, right? And I think like like when we first met in Ivy, like I guess people often tell me that when they first meet me, they're like, yeah man, you're like really social.
Yeah, I mean, there's it's a spectrum, right? Some people are more extroverted, others are more introverted, and have to kind of recharge by being alone for a little while before being super social. I think I'm one of those individuals. I A lot of people, for example, in my travels, even family members would ask me, "Don't you get lonely out there, camping out in some corner of the world where there's not many other people?" And to be honest, I didn't feel that much loneliness. I felt actually the opposite. I kind of felt more connected with
Hmm.
planet Earth and nature than I have maybe all of my life. And so, but that's not to say that extroverted people can't enjoy that and the introverted can't be very social. So I think you kind of learn it's a balancing act for me, where I have to kind of recharge the social batteries by having some me time. But so I guess going to your question, well, a couple setbacks. Right now, it's more about what I want to do long term. I've kind of had to juggle sort of what are my long term plans with my current situation, and how do I get to where I want to be? What do I want to be? And so I've been considering a career change. I've been wanting to move from the finance world to maybe perhaps the medical world. And so, my dad's a medical doctor, and so is his dad. And so I never really considered being a medical physician growing up, just because I thought I wanted to do something else. But now I've reconsidered, and I see like it being probably maybe something fulfilling for me, to be able to to cure individuals, I guess in a biological way. You know, that's something I'm struggling with. You know, what are my next moves? You know, how do I make this sustainable for my foreseeable future, the next, you know, 3, 4, 5 years? And so I don't know if that's a setback, but it's something that I'm struggling with. And so I guess right now the lesson is take it day by day, but also like be goal oriented. What's the next 6 weeks look like? What do you want to achieve then? Yeah, it's a process, and I'm learning as I go in a way, but hoping to take the lessons I've learned so far and being able to give it my best, and also accept that maybe you make all these plans and just life has other plans for you. So we'll see.
That's deep. Yeah. It kind of reminded me of Dr. Murthy, he was a former attorney, U.S. Surgeon General, and he was said during his time as a physician, as a practitioner, he would often like help people cure cancer and dealt with like a lot of like people towards the end of their life, and he saw that the people who survived cancer and all these things always had like a really strong support group. They had a strong family. They had like a really strong group of sense of purpose. And the ones that often passed away, no matter like how well the surgical outcome was, or like how talented the physicians were, the surgeons were like the ones that were lonely, always like passed away. And it was interesting. So he saw at a macro scale how lonely we were as human beings, right? Because he worked with a lot of people towards like the end of their life, and
Right.
That's why he wanted to get into more like public policy and things like this, because he wanted to to impact on a more macro scale. So
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I wanted to say that I think loneliness is becoming more endemic, especially in the U.S. culture. There's been a couple books. I think Bowling Alone is one of the books that talks about this phenomenon, the social phenomenon in the U.S. where people are, bowling alone, or myself. Sometimes I go to the tennis court and just hit against tennis ball machine alone, or doing things that used to be more social back in the day, and now people are doing it more in a lonely setting, so or in a lone setting. But I think it has definitely some mental health and physiological effects in our culture, and it's something we should be aware as a culture. Like these have subversive effects to people's health, and that anecdotal evidence that patients who are facing life-threatening situations may have higher chances of survival if they have strong social networks, family environments. Then I think that's something we shouldn't shrug. I think it's super important. I was reading an article on Foreign Affairs magazine about how deaths of dismay is what they called it, which are deaths coming from alcoholism or opioid or drug abuse, and they're going up in the States since the 1970s, and at a really high rate. And the author of this publishing, it said that a lot of the reasons is because, one, wages have stagnated, especially among white males who don't have a 4-year degree. It seems to be like one of the main variables in these regressions that kind of make you immune to feeling or having these high rates of deaths of dismay. People, if you don't have a 4-year degree, you're less likely to get a high-paying job. If you the higher rates of low-paying jobs, then you may not have, I guess, maybe higher chances or probabilities of settling down, getting a house, starting a family, and so it's leading to higher lonely rates. And unfortunately, this is an endemic that the U.S. should address. we should address as a population, and find ways to deal with it. Obviously, this is super unfortunate that's happening during a pandemic, when I feel like people are, in their homes and more lonely than ever, perhaps. But yeah, hopefully it raises awareness of this issue that has super detrimental effects. And so I think, yeah, it's a very important topic to discuss amongst ourselves, amongst with our policy, our leaders. And so, yeah, I think it's super important. Mental health, obviously, I think millennials and Gen Zers are is it Gen Z? That's the younger one, right? Yeah, we're much more aware of how important it is to talk about mental health. Not to say that we're doing everything we can, but I think because social media has obviously its effects of loneliness. So, but if we have so many technologies, Zoom, for example, that can connect us, and so I think, yeah, we just need to be smarter, and also, be more aware.
I think this actually is it kind of goes around circle, because prior to our conversation, I was talking about how I want to create like the fellas, like where we all like write to each other and get to know each other on a much deeper level. And I think that's exactly what I'm trying to create, because I do want to have like, like you said, because of social media and even living in New York City, right? Sometimes like the relationships seem so transactional, right? Because there's just so plentiful in terms of like the quantity of people that you're meeting, that
Right.
I think we just crave that like deep, authentic connection where you get to sit down for a beer and just like, every time you come into town, like I'm ecstatic because I'm like, oh yes, I get to actually have a conversation like 5 minutes, like it's more than just like a water cooler chat. And I think people crave that,
Yeah, agreed. It's true. It's very important. And yeah, I think having even a pen pal, like we were just talking about this before, like it's important. It's just writing down things on a piece of paper, or and sending it out, or having a really great conversation with someone that you feel comfortable with. That's important. And we're social beings, no matter how introverted or extroverted. At the end of the day, everybody's a social being. So it's a biological, physiological need that we have, and so we shouldn't let it go down in our priority list. So I think it's great, the fellows program or anything that people can do to connect in a deeper level, it's second to none, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like innately, because we were hunter and gatherers for so long, that in order to survive, you had to be a part of a tribe, right?
Yeah.
So I think our need for belonging and connection just is visceral. I think it comes back to like at our core as human beings, just being around for how long we've been, for thousands of years. So I think because all this technology, all this social media is like relatively new in our trajectory as a race, it is hard for us to I think, because everyone's just like in a single family household, or at least most people are in like single family households, right? It's like, just it is harder for us to have that like communal feel. And I think certain societies are much better at having like communities, like Akita in Japan, or these communities where as you get older, you're not like forced to like being in a
you're not a social pariah, stowed away in some retirement home.
Right. Whereas, so I feel like the communities where, the grandparents are very connected to their grandchildren, you have a purpose. Those are societies where you live the longest. And, they call them, was it the blue zones, I believe?
Oh, I didn't know. I'm not aware of this concept.
Yeah, there's a book called the Ikigai, where it's the populations who live past 100 have the most 100 plus, have the three balances that they're good at what they do. There's like a lot of the community aspects of things, right? Obviously, like minus the nutrition and just being around like a lot of like fish and green and vegetables and things like this.
Right.
They're good at what they do. They're rewarded for what they're good at, right? So it's like And then what was the last one? Yeah, but I mean, just look up Ikigai. There's a whole book on it, but it's an interesting
Okay.
topic. But I do think, you know, in America, as we chase more of these like material possessions and this like these house like white picket fence and like all these material things, like I think people do start to realize like, hey, like that's actually not really giving me purpose. It's more of like the
Right.
communities that I'm involved with and giving back and helping out others that who are less fortunate
Right.
than I am. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And that kind of reminds me, I once read, actually, it was a different podcast that I had listened to that recommended men in the US to actually go to church, even if you're not
Mm.
particularly religious.
Mm.
Because we have, you know, you could argue we have this like spiritual need innately, but also there's so many social and mental health benefits of going to a church
Yeah.
because you have a community who's intrinsically very supportive.
Mm.
Um, you know, it doesn't have to be one particular religion. You can just, you know, go to church or go practice any sort of religion or faith that you want, as long as it involves, you know, gathering with other people and sometimes singing, you know, together, which is something we don't do as a society. Probably our ancestors did a lot more of, and you get a lot of mental health benefits even of just going. So I think that's something I've tried to practice. I'm not the most religious individual, but I do appreciate the mental health benefits and the kind of relationships you can cater and foster through these you know, gatherings. You know, so I think that's also an important opportunity people can do and can practice. But also, I do think, you know, in context, I think religion or religious gatherings, churches are diminishing. I think statistically speaking in the U.S. because so many people are just not so interested. But I would argue, being someone who's not particularly religious, that there are so many reasons why you should go. And so, yeah, it's cool. I think it's helped me, and especially when I moved over to a new city, it was like, this is something I could do, and it's proven to be very, very beneficial. And actually, I just reminded when I said Foster, David Foster Wallace was the author who wrote Infinite Jest, and he's also the individual who wrote the article on the New York Times. Let me see if it's Roger Feather as Religious Experience on the New York Times by David Foster Wallace. It was published in 2006, and so if anybody any listeners or you yourself want to listen or read that, it's supposed to be a great read of how watching Roger Feather can be such a you know, pretty interesting and formative experience.
And then to wrap it up, I to go back to your point, I do also think that being in nature and exploring like the mountains or, you know, looking into the sky and the stars and the Milky Way galaxy, etc. I think that's my version of a spiritual experience, right? Some people have like their religion and they feel connected, but it's for me when I'm up on the mountain when there's a nice breeze and the vibrant colors and like the animals roaming around and the birds chirping. In my opinion, there's no other more spiritual experience that I've ever experienced than being in that very moment where you just feel like, okay, you know, like
Yeah.
yeah, I just feel so connected to.
100%. And I think it comes down to, what does the religious experience give you? And I think it's very it's like it's kind of universal, and it's this feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that comes down to every religion, comes down to any experience you have with nature. You see a huge landscape, much bigger than yourself, but you're part of it. You know, for a moment in time, you are part of that landscape, and I think that connects you to something that it becomes enthralling. You become spellbound by something, whether it's the stars, the Milky Way galaxy. We are part of the Milky Way galaxy. You know, I can see one of the Milky Way arms in my photography, but at the end of the day, I'm also in this tiny little blue dot within one of those arms. And you just become enthralled by it and moved by being part of something much bigger than yourself. And I think that's what religion gives you. I think that's what hiking or any, you know, experience, whether it be scuba diving or anything like you just become so in tune with something bigger than yourself. I think that's great. I think that's what we find, meaning in anybody. So
Yeah, and then to go back to the video that you shared me, I know it seems like you keep a low profile, or you try to keep a pretty low profile. Um, but yeah, I would love for you to share the video if you're open to it. I can share it with everyone who's listening to this. That video that of Japan, I feel like that's
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I send. Yeah, we can send the link out maybe in the description to the podcast. I would. Yeah, if anybody has any sort of feedback, I'm always looking to improve my film editing and video taking skills, quote unquote. I would be happy to take any feedback or comments. There's a few videos on there that's on my Vimeo channel, but that's the latest and I guess quote unquote greatest. And hopefully there will be more in the future. Every time I travel, I am so inspired by it. I feel like I have to capture it and share it. And so I think that's one way I can do so. And if anybody out there feels like they enjoy it, feel free to, drop a like or a comment. I'm always happy to share that.
cool. Well, thank you so much, Juan. I always enjoy our conversations. I'm honored when you come to New York City, you hit me up. I really appreciate that. And
Absolutely. Yeah, anytime.
yeah,
Thank you, Davidson, for having me. And hopefully soon enough, once all this COVID era is done, we can share a beer together. And if any listeners in New York City wants to join us, I feel like the more the merrier.
yeah, thank you. Take care.
All right. I'll talk to you.